Hey everyone, welcome to On Hand Art. It is great to see you. I am so excited to share this one with you. This piece is about using materials in ways they weren't intended, like sculpting with paint, or turning things inside out, like putting a framework on the outside of the piece. So follow along and see which one of these ideas or techniques you can use for your own amazing artwork. To start, I made a more complete sketch of the piece than I normally do. Now, usually I like to keep my sketches loose, and that way I don't hold myself to the sketch, and I feel more freedom to adjust and change things as I create. So we're just going to have to see how this turns out. I'm also not sure what size I want to make this center vase, so I'm using my water bottle as a guide since I generally like the aspect ratio. That's the height to width of it. Measuring the height is easy enough, and there are actually a bunch of easier ways to measure the diameter, so why I chose this one is beyond me. It works, it's just a little clumsy. But once I got the sizing box drawn out on this baking parchment, I can start building up the paint for the vase. Now, there are also many ways I could do this, such as painting directly on an existing vessel or a frame. But what I want to see is if I can use the paint to directly become the vessel. Now that said, a little structure should help. So I'm adding these copper wires and then I'll paint over them. I didn't expect to use all my cadmium red, but I'm hoping this is a good start. It did dry with a little thickness to it, but I forgot that the parchment paper likes to wrinkle into this regular pattern, and I really didn't like that. So I'm hoping as I add some of what I'm calling my paint stickers, it will become at least flattened out a little bit. And paint stickers are these sheets of dried paint that I peel off my mixing trays. I'll leave a link to a short about them in the description. But once those have had some time to merge with the red layer, I added another thick layer of what turned out to be kind of an ugly mauve. So I ended up covering that with another thick layer of white. That will bring the sheet to its final thickness and smooth out the surface. And when that dries, I'll start forming the cylinder. I'm just hoping it can support itself once I start rolling it. And yes, that's actually foreshadowing, but while that's drying, let's start on the outer cage. I'm starting the outer cage by dismantling one of my old vases to get the wire. Now, I had to tell my wife about it later since she likes this one, but I have plans to replace it later anyway, so hopefully that will all work out. It did take me a while to untangle all of this, but I'll be able to use the same pieces for the structure of this new vase. But first, I need to make the bottom and top rings. I'm using some of the same double-stranded wire for that, and I didn't show it, but I just measured around the water bottle going by what looks right. And then this wire already had a spiral, so I'm just forming it by gently curving it into the size I want. And then I'm wrapping the ends together to lock them in place. And with those ends locked together, I'll solder them with electrical solder. Now, I've had the same spool of solder for decades, but I'll leave the information about it in the description so you can find your own supply. Now, as far as the soldering iron, you don't need an expensive one at all. But for safety, just make sure you find one that has a UL or a CSA mark on it. While I organize my thoughts about how to build the rest of the cage, I'm finally removing the paint from the baking parchment and then cleaning up the edges. Now, in a very happy accident, the pencil actually transferred to the paint, so now I don't have to remeasure or align anything. I can just use a straight edge to guide my knife. And then I'll clip the wires off the top for a straight edge there. But I want to use some of that sheet to form the bottom of the vessel, so I'm going to cut little segments between the wires, and then I'll leave some of that length to fold over to form the bottom. After trying to form it into a cylinder shape, I quickly discovered that I don't have a good way to get it to hold that cylinder shape. So I have to now decide what to do about that. But in the meantime, let's continue on with the outer cage. To start the structure of the cage, I want to build a strong support. And now I have four stranded twists that I'll use as the main supports. And then the trick is to make sure that they're all mostly evenly distributed around that first ring. And with the ends wrapped around the ring, I'll just solder them in place. Now, keep in mind when you're soldering that this is welding, not gluing. So you don't want to move any of the work pieces until the solder has cooled off. And you'll know it's cooled off when it goes from shiny to dull. Then making sure all my supports are the same length, I'll wrap them around the second ring before soldering them on too. Now, for some reason, I always get at least one the wrong length no matter how careful I am. We're just going to call this character. With the strong base ready to go, I'm adding some double-stranded wires to fill in the wall. This is where I can add some character by making sure they're not evenly spaced, give them some angles, even some slight bends to them. And then I'll solder those on as well. And then next I'll untwist and straighten some of the wire to wrap around and create horizontal lines. Now this is also where I can add more character by leaving the ends loose and even pulling a little tighter to kind of gently squeeze a vertical support or two and give them a little bit of an angle. And then I'll solder all of the intersections to hold that in place. Off camera, I added some angled vertical single wires, which you'll see at the end. After looking at the piece, it was missing something, and I really think those completed the whole look. Now, what gives this whole structure strength is soldering the intersections. That effectively shortens the wires and creates triangles and boxes that add a lot of strength. With that part done, let's go back to painting the vessel. I'm going to try a magenta umbra look. How do you say that word? Anyway, this is one of those trust the process moments. I'm starting by generally mixing the colors straight on the piece and then drawing down vertically with my brush. And then I'll drag across diagonally and fade it all in. And then finally I'll add a streak of color at the center point and then fade that in. And then I'll set it aside to dry before taking another look at it and deciding how much I really hate it. So to fix that, I'm going to use all the last of my reds, mix those together, and luckily that matches the vision I started out with. So while that dries, I finally have a solution for making the center vessel. Since I don't want anybody to be able to see anything inside the vessel, the compromise I came up with was to cut the top off this old water bottle and use that as an insert. To do that, I'm using a fiberglass cutoff wheel and my rotary tool, trying to stay along the fold where the bottle kind of curves up towards the top. Now, as you can see, that's easier said than done, but once I get that cut off, I can use a sanding wheel to clean up the edge. Now, just wear an N95 mask or respirator and goggles. You do not want to breathe in metal dust or get any of that in your eyes. And you might want to consider hearing protection of some sort. I'm using these foam plugs. With my insert ready, I can plan where to put the holes for the little supports that will be connecting the center vase to its cage. My plan is to have them connect at intersections in the cage, so I'm going to mark those with a Sharpie. This is a stainless steel insert, so my drill bits are not going to get through that without a little help. To do that, I stuffed a piece of scrap wood in there for some support, and then all I'm doing is hammering a nail at the points I marked to make a starter hole. And then I can drill from my smallest bit to one about the same diameter as the wire I'll be using. Now the trick later will be to figure out how to find those holes once I wrap the paint around the insert. But that's actually an issue for future me to solve. Right now I'm going to go create those connecting wires. Again, I'm just spacing this out by eye just to make sure that the insert is centered in the cage, and then I'm coiling the ends of some 2-strand wires and then cutting those to length. Now right now these are going to be extra long, so I can decide later if I want to wrap them around the cage wires or just solder them and then trim them off. And then to prevent them from pulling apart as people move and touch the cage, I'll solder the coil to effectively make them solid. And now I can wrap the insert with my paint. To hold it on, I'm using contact cement, and then that's going to be mostly where the seam will end up, and then a little around each hole. And then I'll use painter's tape to hold that on while it sets up overnight. The next day I used the wire handle from one of those Jiffy Pop pans to poke through the paint from the inside out. And that's where the contact cement around the holes actually helped out to hold that from kind of peeling off. And then I used a pliers to lower the supports down and then poke them through. Now all I have to do is figure out how to align the cage in those holes like I had them originally, and then I can attach them to the supports. And then once they're soldered on, a little cleanup and I can show you the finished piece. Well, I hope if nothing else I've encouraged you to try materials in a new or quote wrong way. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know by hitting the like button and subscribing. I'd love to have you be a part of the on-hand art community. And if you did like this video, I'll leave a link to one that YouTube thinks you'll also like. But thanks for watching, and remember, you are creative.